Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I'm your host, Daniel Dolphin. Our guest this morning is a lady that I met at the Best Horse Practices Summit, Dr. Sheryl King. She gave a fantastic talk fighting dogma, myths, and misinformation in the horse business. And I know you would think that with that sort of topic, she wouldn't have very much to choose from, but she worked hard and scrounged around and actually found a few things that were dogmatic and myths and misinformation based. Dr. King pursued her love of all animals, horses especially, in college, where she earned a degree in animal science from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She moved west to complete her PhD in animal physiology with an emphasis on horses at the University of California, Davis. Dr. King founded the Equine Science Program at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, where she served as the director for 29 years, retiring in 2012. As a hands-on teacher and manager, she taught or supervised 11 different horse classes, served as general manager of the SIUC Horse Center, overseeing about 50 horses that were used for teaching, research, and breeding. She conducted research in several areas of equine science, including equine reproduction, functional nutrition, general horse management, and equine welfare. Dr. King was named a Fellow of the Equine Science Society in 2009 and also received Outstanding Service and Outstanding Scholar Awards at SIUC. Dr. Sherry, how are you this morning?
I am doing fine. How are you, Daniel?
I'm doing well. And I know, I think this is only your second podcast interview that you've ever done. So, and you're officially retired. So I really appreciate you coming out of retirement and chatting with us this morning. At the summit, you and I had a couple of conversations on the side that I really enjoyed quite a bit. So I'm tickled to get you on here and get to talk with you some more.
I am so happy that you invited me.
Well, we start all guests out with the lightning round icebreaker questions, and these are for points, so take this very seriously.
Okay.
You can win prizes in the end if you do well enough. So, first question, if you were a Jedi, what % chance would there be that you would use the Force inappropriately?
Ooh, 10%.
10%. I love that you're giving me an actual percentage. Most people just...
I'm a scientist, man.
There you go. 10.23 with a standard deviation. Okay, morning or evening?
Morning.
Bay or sorrel?
Bay. Blood bay.
Blood bay? Okay.
Yeah.
Does pineapple belong on pizza?
Absolutely not.
Are you a cook?
I am.
What's your favorite meal to cook?
I just taught myself during the pandemic how to bake bread, which has not been good for the waistline, but I like the challenge. So all kinds of breads have got to be way up there on the top of my list. But you know, I'm a New Englander, and I love St. Patrick's Day because I get to cook corned beef and cabbage. And believe it or not, you just throw a hunk of salted meat in water and let it boil until it practically falls apart. That's my favorite meal. So,
Are you a fan of the Oxford comma?
Oh my. Is that the one where you have to put the comma before and?
Yes, ma'am.
I am not. And
Really?
my grammar check is always telling me to add it, and it annoys me.
Okay. I would have thought the opposite there. See, I like these surprising things. I was figuring you would have had to do a lot of technical writing in your career where the commas and the periods and all of that stuff would be paramount importance.
You're right there, but I am also a dinosaur. And way back when, the Oxford comma wasn't the in thing.
Ah, okay. Well, Do you have a preferred method of teaching? So like, do you like the face-to-face interaction with students, or do you appreciate the new video options and things like Zoom calls like we're on right now? What's your preference there?
Again, dinosaur. So yeah, face to face works better for me. Although I will say that I always have to have some kind of audio visual aids. So I've become pretty decent at PowerPoint. And when you're teaching about horses, it is my opinion that you can't teach about horses without hands-on component. So yeah, teaching out at the barn face to face is probably the best way to get your point across.
I would completely agree with that. I've done several sort of clinics at colleges and things like that. And what I always tell the kids is when you go to interview for a horse job, they're probably going to hand you a horse and they're going to know within about 10 seconds whether you know what you're doing or not. So if you're in the equine sciences and you're looking for a job later on, you had better be able to handle a horse, because you can have all the book knowledge in the world, but if they can't hand you one and trust that you can take it from point A to point B, you're useless. So
absolutely.
If you could choose any superpower, what superpower would you choose?
Wow, that's a good one. What superpower would I choose? Wow. You stumped me on that one. uh, yeah, I don't know. Probably flying.
Flying? That would be mine as
Yeah.
well. Thoughts or feelings?
I was going to say I have the occasional thought.
I would think with a background in science, you probably tend a little more that way than the feeling side of things.
Yeah, I'm not a known for being a touchy-feely kind of person.
Are you decisive or indecisive?
Decisive, but I have to look at something from every angle before I take action.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite piece of tack or horse-related tool?
Yeah, I have this really cool hoof pick that I always misplace, but that's probably one of my favorite ones. And it's handmade. It was made by a farrier friend of mine that has since passed away, and it works phenomenally.
Do you have a favorite book or movie? It could be more than one, too. Sometimes I know that narrow it down to one.
I don't watch TV all that much, so favorite movies I'm going to pass on. Favorite books, I have favorite authors, and I love John Steinbeck. So I guess if I were going to have to say just one, it would be Grapes of Wrath. Kind of a downer, but yeah.
Not the happiest of, yes, ma'am.
No.
I guess that fits that period, though. Do you have a guilty pleasure?
Yes.
I love that answer. I absolutely love what you just did that. Now everybody's going to be wondering. Let's leave it right there. Do you have a favorite dinosaur or deep sea creature?
Wow. My favorite sea creature is dolphins. Yeah. Bottlenose dolphins. Oh, flipper.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. And have you ever had a UFO encounter?
Yeah, they took my brain. So who are you again?
Believe it or not, that's been about 50% of people have said they think they have seen something that they couldn't explain and all. I threw it in there as just a ridiculous one, but I've been pretty surprised at how many people have publicly admitted that they have seen something couldn't explain or whatever. So,
Ah.
well, Dr. King, I have tabulated your score, and you have gotten...
And it's -3.
No, 712 points, which is our high score so far, which entitles you to either a genuine compliment or an awkward silence, your choice.
Awkward silence every time.
I love a good awkward silence. I really do.
I was thinking, he really is doing that.
For sure. Yes, ma'am. Well, normally I ask people to give us kind of the 30,000-foot view of what they do within the industry, but I guess for you, if you would give us a 30,000-foot view of what you did during your career, sort of areas of emphasis or whatever, just tell us a little bit about your career.
In a sentence, I studied sex and horses.
You waited till I took a sip of tea to say that, too. I love it. All right. So,
I'm trained as a reproductive physiologist, so that was my area of research. And then I taught all aspects of horse management. Outside of that, kind of being of service to the horse industry in general, I saw that you're a member of the Louisiana Horse Council. I was on the Illinois Horse Council for decades, and I was their president for a while. So, that was the pull out bigger view of the entire horse industry and how we can keep it vibrant and help horsemen to survive.
Yes, ma'am.
And help horses and their welfare. Yeah.
Well, we'll save that for later, but I was going to talk with you a little bit about some of the legislative matters and some of those things that a lot of horse people might not be aware of, and how close we have come several times to not really having a horse industry anymore.
Exactly. And isn't it sad? As you said, a lot of horse people aren't aware of it. Matter of fact, there's kind of a quarter done article sitting somewhere in the bowels of my computer called the myopia of horse ownership, and it's basically horse people like to spend time with their horses. They like to spend time either in the barn or on their horse or whatever, and they don't look up very often to see the great wider world that they occupy, which is shrinking.
For sure. Yes, ma'am. Well, you founded the Equine Science Program at Southern Illinois University. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? That must have been pretty interesting, building something from scratch within an academic environment. I mean, what was that like?
There was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I like to remember the good, and the bad and the ugly often creep up to ruin that. But yeah, when I got there, they had a barn, and they had gotten rid of, recently sold off a herd of very inbred saddlebred horses, which I was rather happy about because I don't know a thing about gaited horses. And then they supposedly gave me carte blanche to rebuild. So that was a 29-year odyssey swimming against the current. You can imagine, I was the first woman ever hired in the College of Agriculture at Southern Illinois University. So I was an N of one amongst, I want to say about 40 older men. And in the animal science department, it was very traditional animal science. So if you can't eat it or wear it, it really, to a lot of those people, it doesn't belong in an animal science department. You've probably run up against that. So they didn't know what to do with horses or horse people. And then about 99% of my undergraduate students were female, which was a good thing demographically, because I brought in females. And my particular college really had an imbalance of male female. So they were looking for more females to join the university. It's just people in my department, I think, secretly weren't all that happy with having that many horse crazy women walking around their hallways. You notice I'm parsing my words here.
No, that's fine. I
Yeah,
had a little
challenge. And then there were a whole bunch of things that were unique to running the horse program that weren't rules for the other livestock species. Like all the animals that I had to get into the program, I wasn't allowed to buy. I had to have them donated. You can imagine nobody donates their best horse. So I used to joke with the students that we had every blemish and unsoundness known to the horse industry that I could demonstrate during class, you know, and behavioral problems and all kinds of other things. But it was fun. It was fun, you know.
Yeah. Well, I was at Louisiana Tech, and we had a little different experience. Of course, I'm coming up in the late 90s, but I'd say we were about 50-50 male, female in all of the animal science. So in dairy, beef production, the equine program, the pre-vet program, we were, I mean, they might have been 60-40 here and there, but nothing was 90-10, you know.
Wow.
But we were in a similar instance where we mostly had donated animals, but the equine program there was mostly racehorse based. And we had at that place for a bunch of college kids to learn on, to this day, one of the rankest, most dangerous stallions I have ever come across. He was legitimately a very bad to the bone kind of a stallion. And the program, it's not really a funny story, I guess, but it makes me smile a little bit because of the luck of it all. The guy running it finally got the university to allow him to buy a horse. And he bought a quarter horse stallion that was cutting bred, but he was maybe 20 or something. He was toward the end of his breeding career, but we were hoping to get a few years and change some bloodlines with him and all. And the dang thing colicked and died a month before breeding season.
I don't mean to laugh.
No, but you used to see the humor of the luck of the. I think they spent $3,500 on him, and it was the first horse that wasn't donated with all kinds of problems and everything, and a month before getting some use out of him, he ups and dies on us. So that's the way that university programs run sometimes.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. And like I said, I mean, you can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear and say, yeah, we've got a great diversity of horses that we can learn from, you know, but it sure would be nice to have some of those really wonderful horses too.
Yes, ma'am. Well, that stuff is like in my career, I've mostly dealt with quarter horses, and I've mostly dealt with young quarter horses. So there are tons of physical ailments that you tend to see in older horses or in certain breeds that I haven't really personally ever come across. They're still in theory to me. So having students be able to actually see some of that stuff, I guess, is kind of useful. So.
Yeah, and we also, our program also had emphasized racehorses. We had both thoroughbreds and standardbreds. It was at the point, at least when I started my career in Illinois, that Illinois was one of the leading racing states in the country. Now it's pretty much the opposite. So obtaining former racehorses was pretty easy. And my background was much like yours. I mean, I'm familiar with quarter horses. So learning on the ground and learning quick about racehorses was a real education for me. But luckily, we ran a number of stallions through our program, and we didn't have any really rank ones, knock on wood. Yes. Some were a little bit more challenging than others, but yeah.
It's kind of my opinion that this horse was made, not born. You know, it was, I don't think we were the first place to breed it, but handling breeding stallions is an art form. There are some people that are really good at it. There are some people that should never, ever, ever be allowed to do that. And I think he came from one of those sort of situations. I don't know that he could have been fixed. I tell this story a lot of times. I think people underappreciate how powerful the bite of a horse can be. The stallion's name was Dancing Again. He was a big chestnut thoroughbred, beautiful horse. I mean, he could be one of those statue sort of horses, but the two most experienced people that we had there at that program were generally the ones to handle him. And he, on 3 separate occasions, picked both of them up, grabbed them by the side, by the rib cage, picked them up and tossed them like a rag doll. And people just have no idea how strong the bite of a horse can be. And I'm always cringing whenever I see the little kids hand feeding treats and things like that as to how quickly that can go sideways, and people just have no idea. That was around Ruston, Louisiana. There was a lady there who was a breeder who had the bad habit of walking out into her herd of brood mares, and she would keep sugar cubes in her shirt pocket and feed the mares. And she had a mare bite her breast off going for the sugar cubes in her shirt pocket. So I'm sorry if this took a dark turn, but let there be a warning there about how powerful the bite of a horse is, and you really want to do things to not get caught by them in that way. Well, I was hoping I didn't run you off with the ripped off booby comments or anything.
Oh no. One of my favorite pictures that I keep on my desktop is this picture of a young lady feeding a horse by holding a carrot in her mouth, and he's eating at the same time. And I'm like, this is a really good way to lose your face. And people just say, and if I post that, I've posted things like that before on my Facebook page and warned people. And inevitably, you always get the comments about, it depends on your horsemanship and your individual horse and how trustworthy they are. And I'm like, yeah, they are until they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, the 2 people that were handled by the breeding stallion were the 2 most experienced people in the whole deal,
Yeah.
I was actually approached a few years ago by a law firm from New Orleans asking me if I would be an expert witness in a trial. And the deal was a lady had decided she wanted to be around some horses. And so she got a basket of carrots, drove up to a barn that she had no connection with. She didn't know the owner. She didn't know anybody that owned any horses there. She just pulls up to a barn, gets out of a car, goes into the barn, starts giving carrots to the horses in the stalls. And one of them wound up biting her thumb off. And They wanted me to get on the stand and say that, showing up to a barn that you didn't know and feeding carrots to horses you didn't know was a reasonable thing, and that she was not at fault for having lost her thumb.
Oh, they wanted you to defend her.
And I said, I can't do that, I'm afraid. So, the world we live in, huh?
Interesting. I've done a couple of those kind of trials, luckily on this side of horse sanity. And one of them was the scene had been explained to me. This woman had gotten off her horse. It was in a local area that's really rural. She had tied the horse up to a hitching post in order to go into this store and everything. Some dogs in the neighborhood were barking, didn't attack the horse, but were barking close to the horse, who freaked out, pulled off his bridle. So the owner came out, got on the horse, and then reached over its head to pull the bridle back on. And was that a reasonable thing to do? And I'm like, really? So I get into court, and I'm facing this I guess it's not the defendant, it's the whatever plaintiff. It is, the plaintiff that's suing. And it's one of my former students.
Oh.
And I looked right at her and I thought, honey, sorry, that was really stupid. And I never taught you how to do that. So you get what you get.
Yeah. Well, This is not politically correct, but stupid should hurt. I mean, that's why it should hurt, and it teaches you don't do that again, right? That's
right.
The point. Well, within your career, I'm sure you were involved in some research projects and stuff. Do you have any of those that you're particularly proud of or would like to talk about or anything?
Most of them are really too technical to get into, and it involves kinky horse sex anyway. But one of them was interesting. Matter of fact, the reason that I was invited the first time to speak at the inaugural Best Horse Practices Summit, and then got roped into being on the board and everything, was a research project that we did on horse behavior, actually. And one of the challenges I always had, this is going to be a long way around explaining how this research came to be. One of the challenges I always had was that probably half of my student body came from the Chicagoland area. You know, a lot of these young ladies would come in as starry-eyed 18-year-olds that thought that horses were romantic and they wanted to make that their career. Some of them with what I would consider no practical horse experience. They thought they had horse experience. Maybe they had gone on a few trail rides or something like that. So in 4 years, I had to whip these people into shape. And, you know, they started not knowing a thing about horse behavior. And if you can't read a horse, you can't do much of anything, and you certainly can't stay safe. I think you'd agree with me there. So I was always challenged with trying to find a way to get these people to actually look at the stupid animal and not see it from a human perspective and understand what the horse was trying to tell them. And one of the things that, and one of the other problems I always ran into, in my more advanced classes, I was a fan of giving essay tests. And I would always put the students in the situation where they had a certain amount of land and they had to develop it for, and then I'd give them the scenario, what kind of horses they had, what kind of budget they had, blah, blah, blah. And the ones that came from the city almost always made a stall barn. You know, these were, I always made them into poor college students that didn't live on the place, and yet they would insist on putting their horses in a stall, at least at night, and going out there every single day, twice a day, whatever. And trying to convince them that that is not probably the healthiest way to keep a horse, particularly if you have access to adequate land and all of that kind of stuff. So I had these two problems that I was always dealing with. And finally, the way that I figured we could do it is I would just put them out in the pasture with a bunch of horses and force them to watch those horses for a prolonged period of time, not interact with them, just watch them. So we created the horse behavior study, and the entire freshman class of horse students, for one 24-hour period, I would divide up the class, and each student would have to watch a horse and check off the behavior that they were doing for a 3-hour time stint during the daylight and a 3-hour time stint in the middle of the night. And we had constructed different treatment groups, if you would. One was a group of horses that were freely out on pasture and had been for a very long period of time. So they were an established group. So they were kind of semi-feral. And then we had horses that were stalled for 12 hours out of the day, either stalled during the day and let out at night or vice versa. And then we had horses that were in the stall 24/7. And the idea was to compare the behavior repertoire, the 24-hour time budget of these different horses, so that hopefully, being a scientist, data, they could look at the data and finally realize what I had been trying to tell them all along is like, do you realize that the horses out at pasture, their behavior is far more beneficial to them than what happens when they're in a stall? So we did that for 5 consecutive years, got a lot of data, crunched it all, and it turned into what was a pretty popular piece of research. So, and spoiler alert, guess what? The horses in the stall don't behave the way horses out at pasture do. Duh. And, even though the horses in the stalls were allowed free choice hay and everything, the amount of time they spent eating, the amount of time they spent moving was vastly different than the horses that were out at free choice pasture. So the one thing that did surprise me was that if you had to choose, if you had to keep your horse in for some reason aside from your own mental blockade, for 12 hours, either during the daytime or at night, the data indicated very strongly that the horses that were turned out at night, their repertoire mimicked that of a pastured horse much better than the horse that was kept in at night and turned out during the day. And what do most boarding barns do? They bring their horses up at night because they're scared of the boogeyman or the coyote, or that the horse the horse is going to run into a fence in the middle of the night. It's like, do you understand horse night vision? Yeah. That was probably my best received by lay people research that I did over 29 years. Did it change the mind of any of my students? The ones that already were turning their horses out to pasture, probably so. The ones that came from the city and, were raised with a confinement system, it's like that got embedded in their brain and there's no way to dislodge it after it gets in there. So the opposite thing as being a witness to the human condition and the way the human mind worked, that was eye-opening for me. I convinced myself that beating my head against the wall for 29 years was fruitless, because there's a certain percentage of these people that absolutely will not learn a better way no matter how you present it. Isn't that a downer?
I even see one of the things that brings to mind for me is within the veterinary community, there is still a pervasive sentiment that, horses do really well in a stall. So if it's more convenient for you to doctor him, then yeah, just keep him in a stall for the next 3 months. And I'm just thinking, man, I mean, I understand there are situations where it cannot be helped, but if it can be helped, they'll do way better if they're not in the stall. There's not as
Yep.
Anyway, like you say, some people you're going to affect, and other people are just going to have, how did you describe it, the myopic vision of people in the horse world? Well, what about, you had posted a post the other day about women in STEM, and as a woman who did her career in a STEM field, let's talk about that a little bit. How do you see it going, and what are your thoughts?
Excuse me. I will say it's getting better. Okay, so I will start on that good note, but I guess from my perspective, when you're talking about looking at higher education, okay, and you're looking at the current demographics of higher education, people pursuing a bachelor's degree or higher, now the majority is female. Okay, so we're well over 51% of the total population of college attending students being of the female gender. And still in the STEM fields, it's far, far less than that, maybe 30%. I'm pulling that one straight out of my nether regions. I have no idea. I would imagine when you get into engineering, it's closer to 10, 20%. When you get into the biological sciences, maybe it's higher. When you get into veterinary science, interesting though, I think in pretty much every veterinary school in the country, the population dynamics has completely flipped, and the vast majority of vet school students now are female.
Yes, ma'am.
So some of the demographics are changing. I would love to see more women in the technical fields. Some of the things that I have read, some of the data that concerns me as a female scientist, goes way back to grade school education. I don't know whether you're familiar with, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of Barbie dolls, okay? But way back when, several decades ago, they had talking Barbie. I don't know how she talked. This was after my kids had grown up, and I didn't allow my daughter to play with Barbie dolls anyway. I don't know whether you pulled a string or whatever, but Barbie would say things, kind of airhead things like, let's go out, whatever. Let's go shoe shopping. But one of the things she said was, I don't like math. Math is hard. And immediately there was kind of outrage from a certain minority of us women out there saying, you're setting the stage right then and there to tell all these little girls not to get into the technical fields. And there's been a lot of social science research that looks at the way that girls and boys are treated in the classroom. And when girls and boys, if you have a co-ed class and you're teaching technical science and stuff, the teachers totally unconsciously call on the boys and don't expect the girls to be able to answer the questions or understand the concepts to the same extent that the boys can. So what I'm trying to say is at a very young age, we're sorting, and we don't even realize that we're sorting. And that's sad because we're wasting so much potential brain power out there simply because the genitals that these people have are different. So that's my views on the whole thing. We need to revamp our education system from the very beginning, and teachers need to learn about their own subconscious biases.
I'm sure that there are things out there that I, as a guy, don't see, but I see a little bit of a flip side to that coin. So I would be all for playing it down the middle, where we don't have any biases. But I do think when we start to socially engineer the opposite of that, and we start to push groups in certain directions that they might naturally tend toward, I don't know that that's necessarily beneficial either. And I can't think of a specific example, but I'll take a Jordan Peterson deal on this just to be a little counterpoint. Like, women are never wanting to go for equality in the field of bricklaying. That's 99% male. They tend to want to handpick we want more equality here, but over here, no, not so much. We're happy to let all the guys do that. Or garbage truck drivers, they don't want women more in those fields. I mean, to me, there have always been women in the sciences. You're a great example. You could have been one of my professors. I had multiple professors in the hard sciences, including engineering. I started out 2 years in engineering. I would say at that point in time, that was the late 90s, that it was probably a quarter to a third female in the engineering department where I was at. In chemistry, I have a minor in chemistry. I would say chemistry might have been the most male-dominated subject. Maybe math and physics. All of those would be similar, I guess, but there would have been fewer females. But it was never 5% or something. I don't think there was less than a quarter of the classes were female in any of those directions. But like the veterinary deal, like you say, it's flipped over. Now it's 70% female dominated. And I don't know. I think just let people choose what they want to choose and whatever they have an aptitude for. But as far as handicapping the race so that we get more people like this in here and so forth, I'm not in favor of that. I think it should just be merit based on individual test scores or aptitudes or whatever, and then it sorts itself out however it sorts itself out. I know there have been some sociological studies done. For instance, the Netherlands has gone farther than any other society on earth to legally remove bias from hiring. And in those societies, we had the exact opposite effect that we would tend to see. Engineering became more male dominated and nursing became more female dominated than it had been previously. So when the sexes were really left alone to decide whatever they wanted to do, they became more traditionally biased, not less traditionally biased. And I find that to be pretty interesting. So I don't want to see anyone discourage a young lady from being good at math or whatever. And again, I can say in my experience, I never really observed that, but I'm watching through my own prism as a guy. And so as a lady, you may be more sensitive to noticing some of those things that I would have never noticed. But throughout, I don't want to say this in an arrogant way, but I mean, I was always at the top of the class and in the top group. There were always girls in that group with me in every single facet that I went through. There was never this all boys club setting up. So I never really felt like they were being excluded or in any way. But again, I'm looking at that through my own particular prism. I can say that I have multiple resources that are female. You would be one of those of ladies that are within the industry that I will, when I'm researching something or whatever, I will say, this is right up Dr. King's alley. Let me ask her about this. Or Maddie would be another one of those. So, I mean, I find women peppered throughout all of this stuff. And again, that's my own particular prism. That was one of the things when we were at the summit last time, we had the diversity comment there. And well, I'd already talked about this with Nishan on a podcast, but I was thinking that if people knew all of us as individuals, and you probably know more about the backgrounds of the presenters than the average person in the audience did, we actually were an incredibly diverse group of people. I mean, you had interracial marriages, interracial adoptions, all sorts of stuff. But if you look at it only through the prism of white people or boys and girls or something, then it's easy to draw a line. When you know the facts of the actual individuals, you see that they belong to way more groups than you might recognize if you just are looking at the obvious details of them. So now I'm sure the world has had its moments. 50 years ago, there probably were a lot more barriers than what there are right now. But that's, anyway, my take. Do you feel like there are, I mean, particularly with the demographics flowing, there are more girls in college than there are guys as a whole? There are certain fields of medicine and all that women are kind of really taking over. Social sciences, there's hardly any guys in there at all. Do you feel like there really is work to be done there still? Or
you mean to try to equalize?
Yes, ma'am.
And I guess in a way, I kind of agree with you as far as equalize. Just I think most women or even people of color would probably say just level the playing field. you know? But when you're talking about leveling the playing field, you can't start at the end. You have to start at the very beginning and level it all the way through, and then, give access to the same opportunities for everyone and let everybody pick what they're best at and go for it and let the chips fall where they may. I do see progress, but I do see that we still have a ways to go. You had mentioned, for example, in the medical field, okay, you see far more women doctors now than you did a generation ago. Mm-hmm. It used to be in my parents' day. I remember my father coming across the first female doctor, and he didn't want to be treated by her because he didn't want to have to take his clothes off in front of her. Come on, Dad. But,
I could understand that. Like a female urologist, I am not too proud to say that would be awkward. I mean, it just would. I'm sorry. They have
and women have put up with male gynecologists for generations.
Sure. See, I totally get that. Like if I were a woman, I probably would prefer to have a female gynecologist than a male gynecologist. I would, I totally understand that. Imagine like a 16-year-old girl going in there and that's got to be awkward as hell. No, it seems like it would be a whole lot easier with a female rather than a male. So,
well, and you were saying everybody experiences life from their own perspective, right? Mm-hmm. We're all bound by our own brains and our own bodies. Okay. So you will never know what it feels like to have a freezing cold speculum up your woo-woo.
That's fact. That's fact.
It will send you right off that table.
but see, like I can only imagine. I can only imagine that experience would be 10 times worse if it was my dad's golf buddy who was the wielder of the speculum. Like that, that can't make it better. I'm sorry.
Exactly. Or when they look at you and say, "This is going to pinch," and I'm like, "Oh, I really wish you had a uterus because I would love to help you feel this right now." Pinch. Yeah, right.
Oh, there was another tangent that I was thinking about. We were talking about.
I'm glad you have those brain fugues too.
Oh,
I'll go
sure.
from one room to the next, and I knew exactly why I was going into that room, and then I'll stand there at the threshold and say, "Why was I here?"
I keep my voice recorder on my iPhone. I use it all the time because I describe my thoughts as like sparks coming out of a campfire and trying to catch them. And I know I have some good thoughts sometimes, and I don't want this one to escape. So I use that voice recorder to get it down where I can go back to it later.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, it's gone. Why don't we get a little bit into the stuff that you are doing right now with your presentations? And I consider you to be a meme master. You put together these beautiful pictures and text that bring about interesting facts and things people might not have known. And I definitely consider you a kindred spirit in the myth busting realm. I love whenever we're taking out some of these myths that somehow continue to survive throughout. So do you have some of those on tap that you would share with us now? Maybe how about I've got some categories because I know it's easier to think of when you have too much to choose from. So you do some talking on correlation versus causation, and that's one of those for those of us that do read research, that's a irritating point that we come across a lot in the layman's world. So correlation versus causation. What are your thoughts?
Like you said, that's one of the big no-nos amongst researchers is to misinterpret two things or events or whatever that are happening that move in either the same or opposite directions with a great deal of correlation necessarily being causing one event causing the other. And That is one of the tools in the toolkit of the person that is trying to lead you astray in mythology, and it's a pretty powerful tool because the human brain tends to want to say, if A and B are both moving in the same direction, then A has to be causing B. We know that's not necessarily so, but it's an easy thing to get people to swallow. So, yes. Yeah. And it's one of the things that I think the average lay person has to really pay attention to and keep at the top of their brain when they're reading any of this horse material. I'm trying to think, okay, I paint this stuff on a horse's hoof. 6 months later, the horse's hoof has improved in quality. Therefore, this stuff that I painted on the horse's hoof caused the increase in quality of the horse's hoof wall growth. That's not proof.
Yes, ma'am. I always think of the poster child for this is the number one cause of equine eye problems is moon blindness. And we still use that term, and it comes from people. It's generally leptospirosis. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but when it starts attacking the eye, it does it cyclically. So the horse will have eye problems, blindness, may cloud up, may have weeping, tears coming from the eye, and then goes on for a few weeks, and then it gets better, and then it cycles back in. And people used to think it was the moon that was causing this to occur, and to this day, you ask any veterinarian, they know exactly what you're talking about when you talk about moon blindness. It's still what we tend to call that. I have seen multiple instances like you were talking about. You brought up the hoof, where a farrier is trying to keep this crippled horse going the best that they can, and the owner is unhappy with them, and they say, well, we're going to make a big change. We're going to go with a barefoot trimmer who says that they can solve this. And the barefoot trimmer says, well, you need to give the horse 4 months off. And they finally do that, even though the farrier tried to keep the horse sound while they were showing it the whole time, and they give the horse 4 months off, and then they correlate that with it was the barefoot trimmer that fixed the horse, not the 4 months off.
Exactly.
And the farrier never got the benefit of working on the horse with 4 months off. There was another change that got thrown in there. What about, this will be probably my favorite of the topics that I heard you talk on, was colic, because there are many myths that correlate with colic. So why don't you share a few of the facts about that with us?
Well, by a large margin, the leading cause of colic is human management. I'm not saying that wild horses left to their own devices don't experience colic. They do. They don't experience colic anywhere close to the frequency that domestically raised and managed horses do. So again, here we go, correlation. Human intervention and human management, colic goes up. That should be, to a researcher, that would be, that's kind of interesting. I think I will do research to see if it's the humans that's causing this. To somebody else, they'd say, well, that means that there's a supplement that I can feed them to fix this.
Some money to be made here. I smell it.
Exactly. The best way to fix an awful lot of ailments that we run into in the horse industry is to go back to asking yourself the question, what does a horse experience in the natural world? And then try to mimic that as much as possible. So horses are constant grazers. They always have something in their stomach. and they don't have very much in their stomach at any one particular point in time. They eat, it runs through their system, it comes out the other end, they refill it. That's the healthiest way for a horse to exist. And when we put them into stalls and we feed them large amounts of concentrates and we only feed them twice a day, we have completely changed their natural biology. And to not expect their GI tract to react to that is, from my perspective, totally unreasonable.
And a horse has multiple oddities, particularly within their digestive tract, but they really have the actual stomach of a horse is comparatively very small, isn't
very
it?
Small.
Yeah. So they're I think it's a gallon or two, or I mean it's not very big at all compared to like a cow. You've got 2,000-pound animals. A cow has a stomach that's 40 to 55 gallons. A horse has a stomach that's 2 or 3.
Right.
So they really, a horse accomplishes almost no digestion in the stomach. It's really just preparatory and then moves right along. So,
right. And horses, if you think about the way that they evolved in some of the worst biological niches, or I should say most challenging biological niches. You take a cow and a horse. I am not advocating this, okay? But you take a cow and a horse and you put them out on a pasture that is weedy and straw and sagebrush and nasty, and the horse will thrive and the cow will starve. The cow will starve on a full stomach because the way that ruminant animals attack the issue is to try to extract every single ounce of nutrition out of the nasty stuff that they're eating. So they fill their rumen and then they lay down and they re-chew it and they redigest it and they re-chew it and they reprocess it until they've extracted everything, and then they zip it out the other end. Whereas a horse comes at it from a totally different perspective. Nasty food, eat what I can, move on, eat more. Zip it through your system. You might only be 65% as efficient as a cow in extracting the nutrients, but you're replacing them constantly. So it's like water going through a pipe, you know? You can either put it into a pool to sit there for a while and whatever settles down to the bottom you use, or you run it constantly through the pipe with a filter in it. And you collect what you can off of that filter and move on. That's the way the horse approaches the world. So just treat them that way, and you're going to eliminate a lot of the digestive upsets that humans have created for them to begin with. Now,
one of the sayings that we kind of have in the training world is that most horses these days are overfed and underworked. But horses, this will be a little contrary to the entire nutrition industry, but they really are not designed to thrive or survive on high quality nutrition. They are designed to thrive on high quantity, low quality nutrition. And so like I say, our management practices of putting this high density, high quality nutrition in the animal is really pretty contrary to its evolutionary design.
Absolutely. Now, the one caveat I guess I'd put on that is one of the reasons, maybe excuse, it depends on the individual animal, that we have upped the nutritional value of what we're offering our horses is because we're supposedly asking more of them than a horse out in the wild. You know, horse out in the wild isn't voluntarily going to participate in a 3-day event. You know, they eat, move a little bit, and eat a little bit more. A wild horse generally covers about 10 miles a day, but at a walk, by and large. Mm-hmm. So we're asking our equine athletes to do a lot more which means we have to feed them a little bit differently. Not necessarily in volume, but maybe in quality. But then getting back to your issue is the vast majority of horses, at least in the United States, are under-exercised. And again, to me, it's the difference between the human perception of exercise and the horse perception of exercise. A human taking a 10-mile walk, that's a pretty sizable hike for a human. Like I said, a horse does that every day, left to their own devices out in a normal pasture where they have to walk around in order to get what they need to sustain them. So 10 miles is nothing to a horse. You know, an all-day trail ride is nothing to a horse. Mm-hmm. But to the human who's exhausted and practically collapses by the time they get off of that 12 hours on a horse, you know, they've done a heck of a lot. Well, just don't project the human condition onto your horse. It's a different species coming from a different perspective altogether. We have to meet the horse where it is.
Yes, well, we as humans, that perspective is also often clouded by being overfed and underworked. So
yeah, yes, that's true.
Really, to people, like a person walks 2 to 3 miles an hour. So that 10-mile hike, if you had initiative, is only a 3 to 5 hour exercise. You could actually walk 10 miles a day relatively easily if it was all you had to do today.
Right. And people generations ago did that all the time.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
There was an interesting thing I was reading not too long ago. There's a whole area of human research now that's exercise physiology type research, which is another area that fascinates me in the horse world. That humans actually work, I mean, we always talk about this bipedal locomotion in humans and how it's really screwed up our bodies and everything, and we always have back problems and everything else. And actually, a lot of anthropologists are saying the human body is geared towards long-term, long-distance movement at speed. A human was designed to be able to trot pretty much all day long. Mm-hmm. And being a hunter-gatherer, the hunter part of that equation, they'd have to trot around all day long to follow the prey until the prey either slowed down for the night or got exhausted or whatever. And evidently that's what humans are really, really good at. So human civilization hasn't been kind to us in that regard.
Yeah. Now we wind up sitting in front of a screen and we wind up with back problems and glasses, right? So, yeah, maybe we're just not doing what we were really designed to do. Well, this started out with colic, and there were a couple of things that you had said in your talk I wanted to specifically talk about. One of those, and I have always had an issue with this, that there is still this pervasive deal about my horse is colicking, better make him walk 8 miles. So you talked about that a little bit, and I have never thought that was a good idea. So please expound on that.
I don't know where the idea came from. Well, no, I do. The idea of walking a horse that is colicking was to prevent it from rolling. Okay, with the idea that a horse that rolls is going to create more issues in their GI tract. Okay. What they went back to, they meaning not scientists, but maybe lay horse people, is when you look at the internal anatomy of the horse's intestines, okay? Unlike the intestines in you and me or in a lot of other species, the horse's intestines are a bit more floppy. Yes, they're attached to the abdominal wall, but they're attached to the abdominal wall somewhat loosely. Okay, it even affects their ability to breathe when they're running, but we could get into that later. So the idea being that a horse rolls around, it gives the opportunity for the intestines to flop and twist over one another and create a torsion. Okay, which torsions are one of the worst forms of colic in horses. But it's not caused by a horse rolling. If it were caused by a horse simply rolling, every sweaty horse that we turned out into a dusty paddock would colic, because what's the first thing they do is they lay down and they roll. And it doesn't make any difference whether their intestines are gassy or hypermodal or anything due to a digestive upset. Laying down and rolling isn't going to create that torsion situation any more than laying down and rolling when they're healthy. Okay? A horse lays down and rolls when they're feeling gut pain because they're trying to find a comfortable position. Their gut hurts. So the current thinking is now, if a horse is rolling around, if they're not thrashing to the point where they're going to harm themselves, if they're laying down somewhat comfortably and occasionally rolling back and forth to find themselves a better position, let them. Don't worry about it. You know, I know if I had a really bad case of gas, let us say, and all I wanted to do was curl up in a fetal position and wait for it to pass, the last thing I'd want to do is have somebody get me up and walk me around. Same thing with a horse. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're not doing any good. You're possibly stressing them out more. The only thing that I could say that's positive about a person walking their colicky horse is it gives the owner something to do and something to occupy their mind while they wait for the vet to show up.
So it would be fair to say this is kind of another causation myth, that rolling is the symptom, not the cause. And so we kind of have that backwards in our minds for whatever particular reason.
Absolutely.
What about some other, I had separated this, but we're kind of talking about digestion and nutrition. Are there some other pretty pervasive nutrition or digestion myths out there that you like to talk about?
If you look at any horse care catalog, if you just Google up anything about horses on the internet, you're going to come across gobs and gobs and gobs, hundreds of different kinds of supplements for horses, you know. And for every ailment, for every perceived whatever that your horse has, somebody has got something they can sell you in order to try to fix that. In reality, like we had said, you know, horses gain pretty much everything they need from getting constant access to a pretty low quality foodstuff. So they're really good at either manufacturing or extracting what they need from their diet. Do they need a whole bunch of different kinds of supplements? By and large, no. But there's a really wealthy and healthy supplement industry that's going to argue that that is not true. And I am not in any way saying that any one particular horse doesn't have a challenge that might be helped by certain kinds of supplements. But as a general rule, your average everyday horse that you have for your own personal pleasure, that you're going to ride on weekends on a trail ride, that you keep out at pasture most of the time, do they need all of these different supplements? No. And it's the same thing in the human supplement industry. You can go so overboard. A lot of these show barns that I used to go to, and these horses were so over supplemented, because if you look at a lot of these supplements, vitamin supplements in particular, they start with your fat soluble vitamins, your A, D, and E, and then they layer other stuff on top of it. So when you give your horse in the evening, you know, with their grain, a squirt of this and a scoop of that, and sprinkle on something else and a couple of little pelletized supplements on top of it, all of a sudden you have overfed them the fat soluble vitamins. And A and D in particular can cause big problems if you oversupplement. when I went to graduate school at the University of California, I was studying over in the animal science department, but a lot of my friends were over at the vet school. And there was one particular friend that was getting his PhD. He was a veterinarian, but getting his PhD in pathology. And he knew I was so interested in anything that came in horse-wise. So he'd give me a call when interesting stuff would come in. And he gave me a call one day. They were doing a post-mortem on a horse that had had presumably a heart attack, a racehorse. So, it had a whole bunch of different kinds of supplements. Went in there, and that horse's aorta, the aorta that goes into their heart, that's about yay big around, was stone. It was made of stone because they had overfed so much calcium from feeding straight alfalfa, and then overfed vitamin D, which took all that calcium and put it into their soft tissues, that basically it ossified his heart. That was a real eye-opener for me. Yeah. And how do you tell this owner that thinks they're doing the best by their horse that you just killed your animal? You killed it with kindness. But we do that a lot with our horses. We don't let them be horses.
Are you familiar with, now I've talked about this a few times, but I just want to keep hammering on it. Texas A&M had done a study where they slaughtered a group of performance horses, and they found that they had intramuscular fat, similar, what we would call marbling if it had been in a cow.
Wow.
To the same degree that we would find in cattle. And so we like to see this slick, fat, shiny, pretty horse, but we're, more is going on inside there that you can't see than what we tend to realize. I kind of hammer on this all the time that body condition score 8 is actually just as healthy as a 3, but we would call the 8 beautiful and the 3 cruelty, but they're just as far off center from one another, so killing them with kindness.
And that brings up an interesting idea that in the developed world, our perception of what is a healthy weight is warped, especially in America, with the fattening of humans and the fattening of our pets and our fattening of our horses and everything. That the healthiest body condition score for a horse is right around 4 or 5, So when they take a deep breath, you can actually see their ribs if they're all shed out and everything. Like you said, that person might be reported to the Humane Society.
Mm-hmm.
And over in the UK, they have the same kind of problem. They actually did a study, and the vast majority of horse owners do not recognize obesity in their own horses. Even when they go through a whole course, taught the 9-point body condition scoring, when they look at their own horse, they don't see it. They're not capable of seeing that their horse is too fat.
Yes, ma'am.
So mindset again.
I see it a bunch. I mean, when you can't even feel the ribs, when you start putting your hand on the side and you can't feel the ribs, like you're on one end of that scale, and it's not a good one.
My friend used to say, if you can roll an egg down their back, they're too fat.
Oh, and I have had, just as you're saying, we're out in the country and we've got 2 highways that go right past the place, and I have had in the past a horse that was in its 30s out here, and I currently have another one, and he doesn't look so hot, Yeah. And I do kind of live in constant fear that we're going to have animal control show up out here one day, and I'm like, hey, I mean, he's 35, what, that's just what they look like, I mean, I know there are some people that manage to keep really old horses looking pretty good, and sometimes you can, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes they look kind of rough,
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. At the university, there was one research project that I was doing on old horses. I recruited a bunch of old horses, and we had to keep them in the back pasture away from the road so that people going past wouldn't see, and some of them looked pretty rough. They were getting the best nutrition. It was a nutrition study sponsored by a major feed company that was testing a senior diet. I mean, they were getting fed well. It's just they're old.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, this horse still, that's kind of my litmus test is, well, as long as they still have that twinkle in their eye and they're moving around reasonably comfortably, then I think the best thing I can do is just let them be a horse as much as I possibly can, but it is just a fact that if you're doing that, you kind of have to live in fear this day and age, because if they're just being a horse but not as fat as the general public thinks they should be, then you might be in trouble.
Oh, have you ever gotten that telephone call from these panicked people that have been driving past and said, your horse is laying down? I've got that all the time. Go get it up. It's dying. I'm like, no, horses do lay down.
just let them sleep, man. Yeah. No, I do. I have a friend that lives, or his horses are kept at a major intersection in town, or kind of right on the edge of town. So he's got cars coming past, and he has people calling on him all the time. And he tends to, I've gotten where I hate the word, but he rescues a horse every so often that he finds in bad shape, and he'll bring it to his place, and he's now nurturing it and feeding it up right. And every time he gets a new one in, he's going to have 3 or 4 calls made on him, and the animal control knows who he is and knows what's going on, but they still have to respond. And he raises goats, and he'll show them the new baby goats, and they have a little camaraderie session and all. But it's just I guess it's just evidence of how divorced we are from reality on some of these things. So
yes. That brings up a good point too on the humane societies. In most townships, I call them townships, the humane groups are populated by people that are dog and cat people, but they're getting called out on horse calls, and they're not familiar with horses at all. So it's pretty easy to lead them down the wrong path, or for them to make a wrong decision. And I could recite chapter and verse of a number of horse people that have fallen on the wrong side of the humane people, and it was just a matter of they were judging the horse situation by how they would judge a dog or cat situation. So we need to do a better job of, as horse people, I'm getting on my Horsemen's Council soapbox now, as horse people, making sure there's at least one horse person sitting on all these regional humane groups, or at least a horse person that the humane group can give a call to and say, hey, will you come out on this call with me?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fantastic idea. Well, I don't know how deep down that rabbit hole you want to go.
Oh, we can get into some pretty touchy subjects right now.
It gets pretty deep.
Okay, folks, my interview with Dr. King went fairly long, so we're going to break it up into 2 parts. Let me know how you like that, whether you prefer them a little shorter or whether you don't mind the 2.5, 3 hour marathons. I would point you to Dr. King's group that she started, or Facebook page, where she's going to disseminate some of this wonderful information that she has. It's called Simply Horses. We're going to put the link to it in the show notes for this episode and for the part 2 episode. Also, if you would like to leave me some feedback on these, we take that in our Facebook group for dolphin horsemanship, which is called Bits, Spurs, and Good Sense, which we will also link to. And please don't forget to leave us a rating if you're listening to this on a directory that allows for that, or maybe even a comment. The algorithms love that stuff, and it really helps us to grow the podcast and get our message and interviews out into the world. Thank y'all much, and we'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week for another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I've been your host, Daniel Dolphin.